This is an introduction to historic gardens and designed landscapes in Scotland, why they're important, and the kind of thing we can discover about them through research and survey. I'll begin by confessing my relative lack of knowledge of many of the gardens of Aberdeenshire and by apologising for my mispronunciation of Aberdeenshire place names. My particular interest is in the gardens of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and I'll concentrate this evening on gardens and landscapes from the northeast of Scotland, a region which has an interesting record of garden creation from the medieval period to the present day. Many of these gardens do not survive in an immediately recognisable form, so you will have to use your imagination to replant and repeople many of these gardens, and the images of what I've identified as gardens may come as something of a surprise. The exploration and recording of a garden and a designed landscape is one of the most rewarding and enjoyable forms of archaeological survey, and especially aerial archaeological survey, employing detective instincts, detailed research, and aesthetic appreciation to recreate both the original garden and to ensure the preservation, at least in paper or digital form, of its surviving elements. Gardens are an important part of the culture of the ages in which they were created. An appreciation of gardens is enhanced by an understanding of the culture of the period to which they belonged. Recent work, fairly recent work, on the National Trust for Scotland's Gardens in Aberdeenshire was carried out by Shannon Fraser, now in Northern Ireland. And I should also mention here the researchers and enthusiasm of Douglas Simpson of Aberdeen University, who lived from 1896 to 1968. His enthusiasm for the gardens and buildings of the northeast, and indeed the rest of Scotland. Without his pioneering work, much less might survive to be considered today. Gardens are on the whole a fragile class of monument, subject to constant variation on a small scale, and on a larger scale, relatively easily changed or abandoned, leaving little or no trace at ground level. By their very nature, the remains of gardens tend to be ephemeral and subject to constant change, ranging from minor alteration, modification, to wholesale reconstruction or even obliteration. In the 18th century, Aberdeenshire and the northeast generally were especially concerned with remaking their gardens and estates in a new aesthetic, and I shall have to use some examples from neighbouring areas to make certain connections. A magnificent exception to what I have just said is the garden at Pitmedden, which both preserves and recreates some of the concerns of gardeners in the later 17th century, although its sometimes rather garish planting makes this snow photograph one of my favourites. I'll now give a short explanation of crop marking at this point, because various gardens, particularly medieval ones I shall be mentioning, have been destroyed by ploughing, only to emerge in fields of crops, particularly barley and wheat, and others probably remain to be recognised. These principles apply to many forms of archaeological monuments, forts, settlements, etc. But some gardens come up very well. When a crop, and this includes grass, is put under stress by lack of rain, the plants over the buried ditch have access to more moisture. This would be the ditch there. In most years during the summer, in more fortunate parts of Scotland, the rainfall is insufficient to replace the loss of water from the soil by evaporation. The water loss is greatly increased by the moisture extracted from the ground and transpired through the leaves of the vegetation. The moisture deficit is made up by water stored in the soil during the winter, but usually in April, the soil begins to dry out. If this condition becomes extreme, it impedes the growth of the crop or the grass, and the crops may begin to flag. Those planted over a ditch with deeper soil beneath would suffer stress at a later time than crops growing in shallower soil. The crop grows taller and denser foliage, and what may appear as a darker colour in the crop may actually be the effect of shadow cast by the taller crop. The other side of the diagram illustrates what the converse of this procedure, where a stone wall or a path or statue base prevents the corn or grass from rooting deeply, so it grows less freely than the surrounding crop. This diagram is based on discoveries at Glamis Castle, where the outline of the inner court with its flanking gardens, the inner court, the flanking gardens, and here, emerges in a very dry summer. In this photograph, even the bases of the statues bought by the Earl of Strathmore in the 1680s, very small dot there, and a small dot there. They can be recognized as they were depicted in an illustration by William Elphinstone in about 1750. And this is one of the ways in which previously unrecognized gardens and details may in the future be discovered in Aberdeenshire. In common with the rest of Europe, the Scottish tradition of gardening can be traced back through the gardens of the monasteries to those of the villas of ancient Rome. Scotland was exposed to the same writings on classical gardening as the rest of Western Europe. The Roman villa was a place for agricultural production and recreation in the country. As an institution, it ceased to be viable during the unsettled period after the fall of Rome. But some of the traditions of the villa survived through early monasteries, which were founded on the sites of villas. And with the spread of monasticism across Europe, into Scotland, like the rest of Europe, the traditions of gardening and of agriculture would pass through the whole of the continent. And Scotland, like the rest of Western Europe, had its spiritual ties to Rome, although it never boasted any villas. This common cultural background is more important than the differences between the various countries and their differences in climate and relative wealth. By comparison with buildings, gardens are for the most part relatively inexpensive creations. And the gardens I shall be discussing were, for the most part, only one element in the landscape surrounding the castle, monastery, or mansion. Orchards, kitchen gardens, enclosed parks used for some form of hunting or for grazing horses and cattle, courts, dovecots, and other amenities all contribute to the landscape and to the prestige of their owner. The first gardens usually discussed in Scotland are those of the monastic communities which colonised the west of Scotland and the Isles of Hebrides in particular, from abbeys in Ireland. Iona, on the screen, the most prominent of these was founded by St. Columba about 603. The site of the early monastery, which was presumably approved by Columba himself, lies on the gently sloping eastern plain. The central area is protected from the west by the rocky outcrop here, known as Crochan Carnan. Survey and excavation indicates an organized series of enclosures which would have included gardens within the monastic vallum or bank, which you can see on this plan coming around here. And you can see some of the divisions within it, which have turned up either through field survey or through resistivity survey. Chapter 66 of the Rule of St. Benedict declares that the monastery should, if possible, be so arranged that all necessary things, such as water, mill, garden, and various crafts, may be within the enclosure, so that the monks may not be compelled to wander outside it, for this is not at all expedient for their souls. The life of St. Columba, compiled by Adomnan, who became one of Columba's successors as abbot of Iona in 679, survives in a copy made there during the author's lifetime. It provides the first mention of a gardener in Scotland. It records that Columba sent one of his monks, a man called Trenan, as a messenger to Ireland. Finding himself to be one man short of a full boat crew, he complained to the saint, who replied that he would have a fair following wind to Ireland, and that the first man he met on landing would return with him to Iona. This was Lazaran, described as a gardener and holy man, who spent the rest of his life in the monastery, presumably in charge of the herb garden and other crops required for the monks. Excavations on the island have not to date revealed the surviving pollen of plants belonging to the time of St. Columba. The plan of a monastery, preserved at St. Gall, it was founded by an Irish monk in the 7th century, contemporary with the flourishing of Iona, in what is now Switzerland. This plan was presented to Gosbert, who was abbot there between 816 and 836. The plan is to a degree that of an ideal or typical monastery, reflecting the complex roles of monastic houses in the 9th century. It shows 2 gardens, good details. One, the infirmary garden, the herbularius next to the physician house contains 16 beds, and each with a named herb, while the other next to the poultry yard was a larger kitchen garden, the hortus, with 18 beds. It's in front of us, growing dill, coriander, onions, garlic, leeks, shallots, celery, parsley, chervil, poppy, savoury, radishes, possibly carrots, parsnips, coleworts, beets, and black cumin. And the orchard, the monastery, was laid out in the monks' cemetery with trees and graves alternating. And this was a pattern that was common in monasteries throughout the medieval period. The movement of scholars and pilgrims across Europe would have allowed knowledge of such a scheme to reach monastic houses throughout Britain and the rest of Europe. Aberdeenshire was host to a fair number of monasteries, all of which would have had gardens supplying vegetable and fruit for the monastic table, as well as flowers for the altar. Unfortunately, little can be traced of the gardens at these sites. Clover, or Cloveth, seen in this plan done by the commission surveyors, has no visible remains of potential gardens, although excavation or geophysical survey might reveal something. There is a 12th century Gallic tradition that Dear Abbey was founded by St. Columba and his disciple Drosten, but this cannot be proved, although it seems certain that it's a religious site, if not a monastery, from before its refounding as a Cistercian abbey about 1219. The manuscript map of Buchan by Timothy Pont in the National Library of Scotland shows deer enclosed by a wall or possibly a ditch. Its closeness to the river would probably allow this to be water-filled. This might reflect an earlier monastic realm of the kind surviving on Iona. Monastic government ensured contact between the houses belonging to the same order. In the case of the Cistercians, abbots of all daughter houses were supposed to meet at Citeaux in France for the general chapter each year, although from about 1180, abbots from Scotland were allowed to attend every 4 years because of the arduous nature of the journey. One aim of the annual chapters was to preserve a degree of uniformity among Cistercian houses. The opportunities for discussion of matters pertaining to the monastic life across the whole of Europe were allied to visits to monasteries en route, so that knowledge of the organisation, including the cultivation and maintenance of gardens, would be extended across all the houses of the order. While the layout of monastic houses followed the same general pattern, the individual nature of each site led to modifications. This slide of the precinct of Melrose Abbey in the Borders shows the area enclosed within the boundary wall. It was irregular in form and covered about 16 hectares. As a Cistercian house like Deer, Melrose was required to be as self-sufficient as possible, avoiding contact with the world outside the precinct. It is likely that considerable areas were used by the monks as gardens. And the later division of the site after the dissolution of the monastery may reflect some of these earlier garden areas. In the case of the Cistercian house of Dundrennan in Galloway, where part of the precinct wall still survives, see it tracing it around here, the modern divisions probably reflect some of the earlier gardens. At Deer, certainly in the early modern period, some of the monastic buildings were used as a house by the Fergusons of Pitfor before becoming the site of an orchard in the 19th century. Some information about the cultivation of individual gardens within the monastic precinct has survived for Cooper Angus Abbey, another Cistercian monastery, but unfortunately, no trace of the gardens around the monastery is visible from the air, certainly. And so, although it's particularly unfortunate, this is one on which we have quite a lot of information. In 1542, the gardens were worked by laymen, and a contract between the abbey and the gardener gives details of the vegetables to be grown there. For one garden, it is laid down there should be 2 beds of herbs, such as parsley, beets, and lettuce, 4 beds of onions and bouquet. Some resemblances back to the 9th century list. The gardeners were also to look after the orchard, maintain the hedges and dikes around the garden, and clean the stanks and fish ponds which were needed to supply the fish, which was a major part of the monastic diet. Unfortunately, the gardens at Cooper Angus are now a flat field, but there are traces of orchards and fish ponds surviving at Cooper Angus's Granges at Cooper Grange, where the now filled in fish ponds can be detected as crop marks from the air. And there was a surviving orchard at Cask Grange, down on the Carse of Gowrie, where in 1503, a gardener called Andrew was ordered to make an orchard with the best fruit trees that he could acquire and surround it with a hedge or dike. The flowers in the gardens of the monastery would include roses, lilies, pinks and violets, all of which possessed religious symbolism related to the virtues of the Virgin Mary. These decorated initials come from a series of music part books by Thomas Wood, who had been a monk at Lindores Abbey in Fife. The monks of Lindores were known for their skill in gardening, supplying both supervision of gardens and trees and plants to the royal gardens. Herbs for medicinal and culinary purposes were also grown in monastic gardens. This book, which belonged to Archbishop Chevez of St Andrews in the late 15th century, shows a miniature of a red-capped physician with a book and a basket of herbs. There's a detail of the book and his basket. There was also a priory at Fyvie attached to the Abbey of Arbroath. Here we see Arbroath surrounded by the later town, and again, difficult to say how one would divide it up as in a series of gardens and orchards. In the 17th century, Mr. Ochterlony of Gynde wrote of Arbroath Abbey that its fine gardens and orchards were now converted to arable ground. Landowners establishing their orchards in the 17th century looked to the gardens and orchards of the dissolved monasteries, which were still being cultivated by lay tenants as sources for fruit trees. In 1813, Patrick Neal, who was the secretary of the Caledonian Horticultural Society for 40 years, prepared a report for the Board of Agriculture entitled On Scottish Gardens and Orchards. He visited many of the former monastic sites in Scotland to look at their orchards, or those near them, And he mentions particularly the Arbroath Oslin, an apple grown in the early 19th century, writing that tradition universally ascribes its introduction to the monks. The monks at Fyvie would have access to their knowledge of gardening. Monymusk is first known as a settlement of Caldees in the late 12th century, but it was gradually converted to a house of Augustinian canons. There are references to 3 gardens at Monymusk Priory, one of which, just to the north of the parish church, was associated after the Reformation with provision for the schoolmaster. Medicinal herb gardens were not restricted to monastic houses. In 1497, only 2 years after its foundation, Aberdeen was the first university in Britain to appoint a professor in medicine. The manuscript map of Aberdeen by James Gordon of Rothimme, published in 1661, shows in Old Aberdeen the Mediciner's house and next to it the Mediciner's precinct. The description of the garden, the depiction of the garden is conventional and of a much later date, but it does appear to have 3 separate plots. And unlike most of the gardens shown in Old Aberdeen, it has no trees in it. This is an image of John of Arderne, a famous medieval physician who's shown sitting in his herb garden in the manuscript of the Mirror of Phlebotomy and the Practice of Surgery. There's little information about the gardens of laymen in Aberdeenshire in the medieval period. A garden at Bass of Inverurie appears in Crown records in 1520. There's mention of an orchard at Kildrummy Castle in 1438, when it was in royal hands, and again in 1503, when it was recorded as formerly belonging to the Earl of Mar. There was a place called Gardener Hill, pertaining to the gardener who looked after the garden near the castle, repairing ditches and dikes and planting trees, flowers and herbs. Important medieval castles, such as Dunnottar and Drum, would have enclosed gardens associated with them, probably under the windows of a solar chamber, but possibly at some little distance. This image of a manuscript from about 1400 shows a king and queen playing chess in a garden enclosed by a timber paling. Gardens of medieval date, which survive only as crop marks, are hall-yards near Cooper Angus, where the line of the wall enclosing the garden is surrounded by a broad, often even these days, water-filled ditch. This less clear example near Rossie Priory in southeast Perth it's not known who the owner was, but and has not yet been identified, but they would be associated with substantial landowners. Bishops and their retinues were among the most widely travelled people in Scotland. The need to visit Rome and receive confirmation of their sees by the Pope, as well as their dispatch by the King of Scots on ambassadorial duties, meant they came into contact with people of the highest rank across Europe. The bishops of Aberdeen had various principal residences on their estates, including Fettineer and Old Rain, of which little survive. One of these residences was on a small island in Bishop's Loch, where it's recorded that Bishop Benham died in 1282. Hector Boyce said that the bishop found such delight in the pleasant groves adjoining the loch that he sought no other retreat, an indication that the appreciation of the landscape was an element in medieval perceptions. This slide shows the comparable residence of the Bishop of Dunkeld, Bishop Brown of Dunkeld, in the Loch of Cluny near Blairgowrie. The garden was on the adjacent mainland. Over here on the site of what was then a deserted royal castle. The lands at Terfursey in Tully-Nessel were let by Bishop Henry de Licton to John Clark for a rent of 8 marks, and the requirements to build an honest house in which the bishop might lodge for 1 night each year. A further condition of this grant was the creation of a garden and the planting of trees. These residences acted as centres for the organisation of the estates of the bishopric, and because of the partial survival of ecclesiastical records may provide some insight into the arrangements which might be appropriate for a lay landowner, where documentary evidence very infrequently survives. An unusual exception to this was found in the papers at Kilravach Castle in Nairnshire. In 1536, the owner of Kilravach, Hugh Rose, was confined in Dumbarton Castle for seizing and imprisoning William Galbraith, Abbot of Kinloss. While he was in prison, a contract was drawn up by which Tom Davison, a burgess of Paisley and a serving man, were to travel to Kilravach to work and labour to the said Hutchin his yards, gardens, orchards, alleys, hedgings and stanks, that's fish ponds, and works pertaining to a gardener to do for such like things of the best fashion that may be devised. The garden, and particularly the orchards of Paisley Abbey, were shown on the map by Timothy Pont. Yeah. And were renowned until the 18th century. The Bishop's Palace in Aberdeen was probably built about 1459 by Bishop Spence and demolished in 1655 for building materials for the construction of an artillery fortification on Castle Hill. It was depicted on Gordon of Rothimay's map, published in 1661, on the east side of Old Aberdeen, to the east of St Macca's Cathedral, and was described as ruins of the bishop's house. It occupies 2 sides of a court to the north and east, with a gatehouse and a fence on the south side leading into what was called the Bishop's Garden. The chaplain's chamber, 4 chambers, 4 ranges round a court, formed this, with a tower at each corner, was built by the executors of Bishop Gavin Dunbar, who died in 1532. And that formed the southern boundary of the Bishop's Garden. Within the garden, which appears to be enclosed to the west by a paling fence, with a roofed entrance gate, is a rectangle of grass and a group of what were probably orchard trees. On the west side, apparently a remarkable summer house, reached by steps from where there was a prospect of the whole town, referred to by Robertson in his Collections for a History of the Shires of Aberdeen and Banff. To the east of the garden was the Bishop's Green, with the ruins of a beehive ducat. Although this is a late source, the layout is likely to reflect that of the 16th century. At the end of the 15th century, gardens across Europe were for the most part of the same type, an enclosed quadrangular space divided into squares or rectangles, perhaps with trees and plants trained into arbours, perhaps with a wickerwork frame, sometimes with a fountain or other central feature. This remained the most common form throughout the 16th century, even in the Italy of the Renaissance. There are other elements, such as the exploitation of natural slopes and water sources, were introduced. Fountains, grottos and terraces, as well as a wider range of plants, became part of the amenities of gardens. The image of the young daughter of the Picts celebrates this introduction of plants from newly discovered territories into Europe. It shows a girl carrying a spear and wearing a sword, and tattooed all over her body, she was supposed to be a Pict, with symmetrically arranged flowers. Peonies, hollyhocks, lilies, cornflowers, irises, horned poppies, columbines, rose campions, narcissus and tulips. The artist, Lemoine de Maurde, was a Huguenot refugee in London who had taken part in a French expedition to establish a colony in Florida, which was overrun by the Spanish in 1565. The anachronistic choice of flowers associates the Scots with the burgeoning flora of the period, whatever the intention of the artist may have been. No book particularly concerned with plants grown in Scotland is known from this time, but Gerard's Herbal of 1597 was used by Forbes Robertson for an account of what would probably be grown in contemporary Scotland. Scotland was part of this European tradition, and particular aspects of it, especially the terrace garden and the design of the garden to provide selected distant views, were adopted with enthusiasm. Gardens of the 16th and 17th century, whose remains survive recognisably today, whether on the ground or from the air, are those where there has been much reshaping of the ground. The 18th century desire to set the house in a more natural landscape has led to some very serious attempts at eradication, as is the case at Drum Castle, where only slight traces of the terraces remain at ground level, although excavation has revealed them clearly. The most important nobles and landowners in the northeast of Scotland were the Gordons, Earls of Huntly, a family very conscious of their status in the region. In 1544, George, 4th Earl of Huntly, petitioned the Crown for the confirmation of change of name of his chief's house from Strathbogie to Huntly Castle. The 4th Earl was Chancellor of Scotland during the minority of Mary Queen of Scots and accompanied her mother, Mary of Guise, on her visit to France in 1551, providing with a plentiful opportunity to see chateaux and gardens at the highest level of French society. It has been suggested that his reconstruction of his palace at Huntly Castle was connected with a visit by Mary of Guise in 1556. Its major feature was a large round tower on the southwest with a viewing platform at the top, which will provide a wide panorama over gardens and park. His grandson, the first Marquis of Huntly, made major contributions to the palace, erecting a first-floor loggia and adding a row of oriel windows to the south front and one on the round tower, to allow the viewing of garden and park in the years following his return from exile in France in 1597. He was described as fully set to building and planting of all curious devices. The only feature surviving which relates to the garden of this period is the truncated 12th century motte, which probably served as a mount from which the garden could be enjoyed. Timothy Pont's manuscript map of this area does not survive, although it appears on Gordon's version. But the map of the Huntly family's other major houses in the north, Bog of Gicht, shows the towered structure surrounded by a large enclosure or park occupied by trees. A similar depiction to that around Huntly on the Gordon map. The trees were probably fir trees. In the mid-17th century, Bog of Gicht was described as beautified with many parks, yards and pleasures. The Castle of Tulchon was reconstructed by William Forbes between 1584 and 1589, and it may be that a celebration of its completion was the occasion of the visit by James VI in July 1589. The property had belonged to the Prestons of Craigmillar, notable gardeners, near Edinburgh, until the early 15th century. And when William created his new works around the rectangular inner court, he preserved the historic Preston Tower and placed his own coat of arms with the date 1585 surmounted by those of the king over the entrance to the inner court. He later recorded on a panel to the right of the gatehouse, all this work except the old tower was begun by William Forbes, 15th April, and ended by him 20th October, 1589. Forbes' new works included a long gallery on the west side of the building, adjacent to a round tower, which had the Laird's private room in it. From both of the gallery and this room, the owner and his guests could admire the garden. William Forbes' library, some books of which can still be identified, was kept in an arched book press in the west wall of the long gallery. 12 bee bowls for containing beehives were constructed along the wall which divides the gallery from the court. A cruciform arrangement of yews and hollies formed two intersecting avenues. When the castle was taken into the care of the then Ministry of Works, a small lake was created down here, where there was formerly a swamp. It may have been originally some form of water feature in William Forbes' extensive and carefully laid out garden. Works at Fyvie Castle were undertaken shortly later. Alexander Seton, later Earl of Dunfermline, was one of the most remarkable statesmen of the reign of James VI. He had been educated in Rome and in France, and was the owner of an extensive library. He purchased Fyvie in 1596 and had carried out extensive works by 1599. Shannon Fraser, until recently archaeologist for the National Trust for Scotland, has been responsible for very considerable work on the gardens there, including a proposed reconstruction of the garden to the south of the castle, based on ground survey and on excavation. Fyvie, along with Crathers and Craigie Bar, is an excellent example of the flattening effect of the creation of a landscape garden. Something of the former impression of enclosure can be gained from this image of his other house, or suburban villa, as he thought of it, at Pinkie near Musselburgh. Yeah, with these remarkable early 17th century walls. Geophysical prospection at Crathers, Castle Fraser and Craigie Bar has revealed evidence for earlier formal gardens beneath their present lawns. Craigie Bar has two major roof terraces, up here and around there, which designed so the family and favoured guests might ascend after dinner and enjoy their sweet wines while admiring the surrounding garden and landscape. Yeah. A mansion was added to the 13th century tower at Drum Castle in about 1619, and there was probably a walled garden with traces of what may have been geometrical parterres immediately to the south of the house, as at Fyvie, with a series of descending terraces beyond, revealed by excavation in 2008. The gardens and policies at Crathers Castle were the creation of the first baronet, Sir Thomas Burnet, who died in 1653, described by his contemporary Robert Borden of Straloch as the man who, by care and skill, subdued the genius of the place, for by planting firs and other trees of many kinds, he has covered the forbidding crags, laid it out with gardens, and clothed it with pleasaunce. There is some geophysical evidence for an earlier layout below the lawns at Crathers. The civil wars of the mid-17th century were not kind to the gardens of Aberdeenshire. Fyvie Castle was garrisoned, and the second Earl of Dunfermline subsequently petitioned upon for relief from paying a levy to support the army, because it being too manifest and well known that his house and planting of Fyvie was defaced and destroyed. Drum Castle was attacked and the gardens damaged in 1640 and 1644, when the Earl of Argyll's foot army cut it down, the pleasant garden planting to be huts. Huntly Castle also saw soldiers hewing down the pleasant planting to be huts for the soldiers to sleep within upon the night, whereby the Hale camp was well provided of huts to the destroying of goodly country policy. The walled garden and other enclosures and buildings around the castle were used for part of the defences by the occupying troops. I've been concentrating on gardens associated with country mansions, where there is some survival of the physical remains of the garden and some documentary and map evidence. There are no surviving estate plans of this period that I know of for Aberdeenshire. And when it comes to the city of Aberdeen, it is most fortunate that the town plan prepared by James Gordon of Rothy-May, which he presented to the town council in 1661, has come down to us. It depicts both old and new Aberdeen, and shows gardens lying behind the majority of the houses, most of which are planted with trees and some of which have simple parterres. From the evidence available relating to his plan of Edinburgh, the depiction is a simplified version of what was really there. The trees are probably orchard trees. Plum, cherry, apple, and pear would predominate. King's College Garden, which lies to the south of the college buildings, appears surrounded by a palisade or a wall with a line of trees to east and south and an indication of a parterre. The Marquis of Huntly's garden appears to have a freestanding sundial in it. And Gordon of Cluny's walled garden has parterres and an orderly orchard behind it, running down to the old Aberdeen Loch. Of the Bishop's Palace, only the garden wall survived. The garden adjacent to the Tradesmen's Hostel also had indication of walks and parterres within it. Aberdeen is presented on Gordon's plan as a garden city, and in the contemporary translation of his Latin description of the town, he writes, "Many houses have their gardens and orchards adjoining. Every garden has its postern, and these are planted with all sorts of trees which the climate will suffer to grow, so that the whole town, to such as will draw near it upon some side of it, looks as if it stood in a garden or little wood." In 1635, the artist George Jameson acquired a plot of land outside the city. And this was also described in Gordon's description of Aberdeen. Next to the Well of Spa, hard by it, there is a 4-square field. Which of old served for a theatre, since made a garden for pleasure by the industry and expense of George Jameson, an ingenious painter who did set up therein a timber house painted all over with his own hand. He was granted tolerance to make such building, policy, and planting within and about the same plot of ground, to the effect the same may redound to the public use and benefit of the town. The garden was supposed to revert to the city on his death. This was an early recognition by the town council of gardens as an ornament to a city and a public benefit. By the time Gordon prepared his plan, the enclosure was bare, but a little summer house or banqueting house was still depicted. After the return of Charles II, Scotland, which had been severely affected by the campaigns of the Civil War on its territory, appeared to resume the pattern of social life of the earlier part of the century. Gardens are restored and new gardens created. In many ways, Pitt Medden epitomises these new gardens. While it is most unfortunate the house was destroyed by fire, it is possible this contributed to the survival of so much of the hard structure of the garden. This was the creation of Sir Alexander Seton. Following the death of his father in the service of Charles I, Seton was brought up in the guardianship of his cousin, the Earl of Winton, a member of a family with a documented involvement in the creation of gardens over many generations. He was admitted as an advocate in 1661 and became an ordinary Lord of the Court of Session as Lord Pitt Medden in 1677. He was Member of Parliament from Aberdeen in 1681, 1685 and 1686, and was dismissed from office in 1686 following his opposition to James II and VII's attempt to repeal the Acts against dissenters in religion, and subsequently refused to sit as a judge under William and Mary, who replaced James II, because of his earlier allegiance to James. The foundation description for the garden bears the initial of Alexander Seton and his wife, Margaret Lauder, as well as the date of 1675. The garden lies at the extent of an extensive network of dry stone walls laid out on a triangular plan and related to the wider organisation of the estate. I shall not describe the garden in detail, but its rectangular divisions Its 4-metre high terraces on 3 sides of the lower garden allowed it to be viewed from above. Its fountain on the upper terrace flowing to a font recess in the stairway, with its double flight of steps, and its 2 pavilions with their ogee roofs at the junction between the lower and upper gardens are all features of the most elaborate gardens after the restoration, with the house as its centre. The main planting is not of the later 17th century, and I've always favoured the more subdued colours of winter and the more recent designs. But Pitmedden is probably the most remarkable surviving recreation evocation of an early garden in Scotland, as well as the most enjoyable. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Irvin? Can you switch us on? Share screen. Host is over. Okay. Okay, Irvin?
Okay, right, I'm here. Can you hand back the host to myself, please, Marilyn?
Right, your screen sharing stop share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. Oh, I've lost it.
What have you lost?
No, that's okay. Can we hear? I was looking at the chat box. I don't think. Oh, thank you very much, Marilyn, for that. I've lost you on the screen. I can't see you now.
I'm between you and
Oh, I
Irvin.
see you. Yes, you're not quite in the centre anymore. Thank you very much for all that wonderful information and pictures that you prepared for us, especially fascinating that you covered so much of the Northeast. And it's wonderful to hear. Yes, well, I think quite a lot of us will have been to Pitmedden, and we know what a lot of work they've been doing there.
Mm-hmm.
But you've obviously, yes, done a huge amount of work in your research of the different gardens that there are in the place. So it was wonderful to hear all that. I was just wondering, did you ever take part in any excavation work anywhere following your research that you did on the gardens, such as at Pitmedden?
No, I never did. Mainly, I think, because I was working, and you weren't let off to do things with regard to your entertainment. Though I did visit some of the excavations after they'd taken place, before they were backfilled. But my view is very much an aerial view.
Well, it's certainly very interesting for the bigger gardens, such as all the formal ones, especially.
Yes. They are much more easier to recognize from the air, because what the eye sees is pattern. The 18th century gardens, with their move towards naturalism, are much less easy to record than the earlier gardens. Something like the same way that I was recording gardens, but I was also recording all other aspects of archaeology, in a way that Roman camps are much easier to recognize than medieval settlements, because of their pattern.
Did you wondered if you worked up to a certain date? Did you stop at a certain date?
Well, you see, I stopped in Aberdeenshire at Pitmedden. If I'd gone on to talk about Monymusk, where you see a lot of the change in estate management, increasingly scientific agriculture, and a different way of looking at gardens, it would have led me quite a long way forward, and a lot more explanation. But I certainly did look at the Aberdeenshire gardens up to about 1750.
Yes, I wondered that. starting from very early on, the monasteries.
As early as we could get, and a lot of that has to be speculation, you know, based on other examples elsewhere.
Yes. Did you start off with maps and the maps of these places and then look at aerial pictures, or vice versa?
No, it was very much vice versa. In fact, if you've got a little time, when I first, forgive me, came up to Scotland in 1978, I was recording sites down in the southwest of Scotland in Galloway, and one of these was Castle Kennedy. And I looked at it, and you could see detail coming out of what I identified as a garden. And you know, after I got back to the office, I went to look up the information about this in what was then the main garden book about gardens in Scotland, for which I learned there should be no such garden, of course, because it was all far too barbarous, so no one ever got round to gardening. And if they did, they would be immediately overrun by you know, warlike neighbours.
Yeah.
This was so obviously not true that my interest really began there in gardens in Scotland. So yes, I started from the aerial view and pursued this aspect of Scottish culture, Scottish archaeology after that.
I wonder if this dry summer that we just had in 2022 will be revealing more.
I haven't actually heard in Scotland, but certainly it was in Wales.
That's it.
But I think so. Assuming this is one of the problems, is what there was someone there to record it. Though at because you have to be there at the right time to see it. Grass, as you'll probably know from your own gardens, it only takes a not very long rain shower to change the place where you can see there's been a form of path in your garden, you know, lighter, shorter sort, and it soon grows back. So it's quite quick, this.
Yes, indeed. Well, there's lots more questions I could ask. Do you have anything, Irvin, or nothing's
not a question, but just to mention that Veronica and I actually worked on the excavation of the garden at Crathis Castle a few years ago.
Oh, did you? No, I'd be very interested to hear more about that. I've asked Shannon for the results of the. In fact, what I've really asked Shannon to do is to write a paper on the results of the survey at the castle. But I think she's very much, you know, taken up with her present work.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure the excavation was led by Hilary and Charlie Murray.
Yes. Yes.
We were just labourers.
The main things we were finding were wine bottles, masses of wine bottles. And was it the 17th, 18th century?
Yeah, some of them with the owner's crest on them, so they'd obviously been specially made for him.
Yeah.
But we also found evidence of two buildings.
Yes, yeah.
And it appears that was a road led up to what's now the main entrance door, all the way up through that what's now a big lawn.
Yes, I think last time I went there, I remember sort of walking over the lawn, trying. Sometimes you get a sort of sense of something underneath it, but I don't think I did. You know, sometimes just, you know, you pick up a slight irregularity.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah, but no, I'd certainly like to know more about that that garden, particularly the 17th century garden, which we'd have a short description of.
Most interesting.
Mm.
I mean, we haven't had anything in the chat, but does anyone want to switch on their or off their mute button and ask any questions before we finish?
I was wondering, with the recent proliferation of drone photography, I just wonder where all of your early photographs would have been quite an expensive and difficult thing to achieve. But nowadays, with the improvement of and different types of camera with infrared and all sorts of things, who's taking advantage of all that now?
Well, various people, but it doesn't always feed into a sort of general knowledge. certainly in drone photography is excellent. One thing that you don't get, and that is the wider view. They tend to use it where they know they are going to find something, or think very likely they are, and you get a very good picture of that. But you tend not to find things you don't know or suspect. So there's a place for both. But for producing detailed plans, the low-level drone records are great, because obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, but with aerial survey, you're not actually allowed to come below 500 foot, and really it's much better to be at about 1,000 for safety of the people in the plane, but also safety of people on the ground. Very strictly controlled.
If you're going to use drones, you can get exemptions. We're not allowed above 400 feet.
Yes, well, you're sort of keeping out of the space that we were in.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but you can get exemptions if you've got clues, and certainly up to 1,000 feet, or even higher. You can get somewhere which cover most of the golf course in Ballada, for example.
Oh yes, that is a remarkable landscape there. Yes, which I have recorded from considerably higher than that.
Oh, have you? Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting remains there.
Well, if you're up here and you want to do any survey with the drone, I've still got one. I haven't crashed yet. So.
Oh, great! Yeah. But certainly, I would be very pleased if anyone were to look at medieval castle sites and mansion sites, particularly in dry weather, or really the opposite of this, in very low light, where you're getting shadow.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. Long shadows which show up very slight irregularities in the ground, but they can be very relieving, and that I would be delighted to hear of people doing, and to hear what results they get.
Oh, right.
Because there's going to be far more gardens than we've got any record of.
I'm sure.
May I ask a question, please? Thanks very much for the talk. But one of the famous castles that's not so far from Aberdeenshire that I didn't hear it get a look in was Edsall, and I wondered if you could talk about Edsall a little bit.
I have talked about Edsall at considerable length, actually, and
to other groups.
Well, no, well, actually, yes, and published in architectural heritage, and in the publication of Scotland's Landscape and Heritage Trust, the SGLH, which is a body of which I'm a trustee. Yes, I have looked very hard at Edsall. It is a remarkable example, and it's of course with the documentation on David Lindsay and the documentation included in the garden. It is one of the most ambitious gardens in Scotland, and it's of European importance because we have so little surviving for that time. It shows how you use the garden to project yourself and how you thought of yourself, with the sculptures, the record of his living there. It is remarkable. I say it, but I can go on for an hour and more on that one.
Maybe we'll ask you back.
That's.
Anyone else, or should we let Marilyn go? She's spoken for quite a while now. So yes, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for this talk and for all the wonderful pictures. And as I said at the beginning, we recorded it. So if anybody wants to hear it again, do contact us. We've got to work out exactly how we do this still, haven't we, Irvin? Because we haven't recorded one before, but we'll get there. Just contact us.